We now have the valedictory session. We'll begin with rapporteur's presentation by Miss Alice and Sanchita from Cuts International. The other panelists for this session are Alan Asher, Chair, Fairer Future and Chair, Managing Consultant, Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance, Australia. Frederick Jenny, Chairman, OECD Competition Law and Policy Committee, who will be joining us virtually. Then we have Teresa Morera, Head, Competition and Consumer Policy Branch, Division on International Trade and Commodities. We also have Eleanor Fox, Walter J. Berenberg, Professor of Trade Regulation, New York University School of Law. He'll join us virtually. Then we have Sothi, Professor Nilai, University Malaysia, and former commissioner. She will also join us virtually. We also have Augustine Head, AP Regulatory Law Practice and former member, Competition Commission of India. Mr. Trimbenskosi, former chairperson, Competition Commission of South Africa. Alexei, Director, BRICS Competition Law and Policy Center. Thomas, Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Hong Kong. And Mr. Navneet Sharma, Director General, Cuts Institute for Regulation and Competition. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the last session, as you probably noticed from your program. What you might not have noticed is that so far we've had 50 presentations, and at the end of this session it'll be a bit over 60. So I think that tells us a couple of things. One, that the amount of information, the richness and depth of information will be rather hard for us to digest, or it would be if it weren't for the clever folks at Cuts who decided to ask two people to be there keenly taking some notes on some of the issues. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Alice to come up and give us just a quick rundown on some of the sessions. But just to put the context around what we're trying to do now is that with that vast amount of information, one could go home from the conference feeling as though, while wanting to get into issues in a lot more depth, there was a vast amount covered and that would be worthwhile in itself. But that's not the Cuts way of things. The Cuts way of things is also to look to the future, look to see how the information that's developed, the challenges and the opportunities that have come from the sharing, to project an agenda for the future, described in the program as chalking a way ahead. And that's what we want to do. We want to use this stellar panel here to help us to identify some clear points of action, to spot some critical issues, to look for short and medium-term issues, so that all of us can, for those areas in which we work or we're interested, can take those on board and take them with us to our future work, whether it's in multilateral agencies like the OECD or UNCTAD or others, regional bodies like ASEAN or COMESA or others, in our own agencies, in our research bodies, or in our enforcement work. There's so much here that we want to reuse, recycle, and further develop. And so even though we're all no doubt looking forward to a release from this room, if I can urge you to focus for the next 2 hours as we work through these things, and I guarantee that you'll be rewarded with takeaways that are put in a conceptually sharp way, and there'll be actionable points that come from it. So let me first call on Alice.
Hello, distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced by Arima and Alan, me and my colleague Sanchita has been given this responsibility of being the rapporteurs for the whole conference, 1.5 past day. However, I will not insult your intelligence by repeating like a parrot of whatever has been said, or trying to summarize the rich discussion that we have had so far. On the other hand, if I miss something out of these 50 plus presentation and speeches that have been said, please forgive me. 1.5 past day, we have gone through 6 sessions in total, starting with the inaugural and 5 substantive sessions. I think it's worthwhile to reiterate a little bit about why we started this and what set the scene for the discussion for the last 1.5 days. We all know that we are living in a time of multiple crises converging on us. Communicable disease, pandemic, armed conflicts, climate change and catastrophes, terrorism and geopolitical churning. All these against the backdrop of fast technological changes, digitization, and increasing market concentration. This has casted a lot of adverse impacts on society, and especially the poorer section among us, such as broken supply chains, rising inflation, loss of job, soaring food prices, shortage of food and medicines. Again, this background, we agree that there is a need to rethink competition and regulation towards more inclusivity, better equity, and incorporating a sustainability consideration. We think that this is now the time for shifting the international discourse to issues more important to and in the interest of developing countries. And we all agree that there is a continued role for competition agency to play in the future in the form of action that they can do. Then across the next 5 substantive sections, we deal with various issues, starting from access to healthcare, IP and competition, going toward the agricultural market and food price, then moving on to employment in the gig economy, then to the big issues of sustainability and climate change, and concluding with responsible ICT and inclusive digital economy. I think we all have realized over the past 1.5 days that there are many challenges and issues that are facing us all. There are issues about new competition issue. There are issues about high concentrated market structures, how we are suffering from excessive pricing and other monopolistic behaviors of big businesses. So the solution or the action are in the hand of several stakeholders. To begin with, competition agency. We can have stronger competition law enforcement. We can think about broadening our merger regime, not confining ourselves within the national and regional context, but maybe moving on to the global level. We have debated and talked about soft law approach, such as regulation, self-regulation, co-regulation, or moving towards socially responsible business. Some of us have even suggested the return of the bringing back of industrial policy, bearing in mind that we should focus more on equity and redistribution aspect. And of course, there should be more reform of WTO rules and freer international trade. Let's not forget, amid this context, the plight of the gig worker and what we can do to protect their rights and interests. There should be exemption in our competition law for collective bargaining arrangement. At the same, we should be able to think differently and try to have a fresh approach on how we assess or interpret market power in the context of the digital of the platform economy. We could have more policy research. We have policy observatory and exchange of best practices. In the same time, we should also realize that there are limits to problems that could be solved using competition law. So let's not restrict ourselves and think more broadly toward labor law and labor standard, industrial policy, or even forward-looking regulation or third-party monitoring of all these policy and their implementation. They will talk about a renewed consumer welfare standard in competition enforcement to incorporate sustainability aspect. There were also discussion about how we should have better consumer protection awareness raising to protect the interests of both consumer as well as ethical and unfair businesses. And last but not least, looking forward, there would be more complex issues to come. Things like 6G, AI, cybersecurity, cyber war, etc. All these mean that we need to have better coordination between not only between all the stakeholder and between the competition authority and the regulator as well as other stakeholder. We should have more pro-competition rules for promoting competitive markets. And I think I end with that and hand over to my colleague Sanchita for some of her take of the proceeding.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you, Alan, and congratulations to everybody for being here for 1.5 days. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy for us to note down all that were discussed and then try to summarize. So what we did was we have 2 different reports. We didn't try to consolidate, but what I'll do is I will just mention 4 or 5 points from my notes, which are basically kind of summary of summaries. Alice, of course, she's much more hardworking and much more sincere, and so she has a nice presentation. I'm just going to speak from my notes. So we discussed what should be the goals of competition policy. We discussed things like should it be equity versus efficiency? From welfare, we should talk about well-being. We should think about cooperation, not just competition, and competition authority should have ex-ante approach rather than ex-post approach. And we talked about different types of cooperation. So, between developing countries on sectors such as pharma, agriculture, competition, generally competition matters, but also sustainability, digital, and as also between public authorities and private parties and governments. So different departments of government. So because, we covered so much ground, so many issues. Basically, we have covered everybody. And I don't think anybody would deny that cooperation is really need of the hour. And there was also some points that what should be the role of the government. We heard that, in India, how regulated it was and government was in all the sectors. So the government should be enablers, facilitators, but also, there is a need to, be forward thinking, particularly because, we have so much changes that are, there are so many changes that are taking place, in terms of technology and sustainability considerations. We also talked about, ESG a little bit, ESG and ESG-like structures, need to widen or deepen ESG, bring in more considerations, possibly SDGs are not even capturing everything, so ESG is one tool that can be used. And in future, we have to watch out for several developments and see, what's happening. And then it's not an easy task for the regulators, for government authorities, but things are happening. So, for example, biologics, data science, algorithms, and 6G, sixth generation telecom, and other high technology, and platform economy. Things are changing very fast. And lastly, this was mentioned by Alice, of course. There should be capacity building and awareness generation among all stakeholders. And we also have to think about, how you can increase bargaining power of workers, gig workers in particular. Thank you.
Well, and thank you very much, Sanchita. That was so. We're going to follow to a large extent the program that you have with just one small swap. But that means that our first panelist will be Frederick Cherney. I mentioned earlier that one of the targets for action from this conference will be intergovernmental agencies like the OECD, and Fred is the chairman of the OECD Competition Law and Policy Committee, and is somebody well familiar with these issues and with cuts as well. So I'm hoping that we have Fred there on the line. Are you there, Fred?
I am there.
Thank you very much. If I could invite you to give us some of your pithy insights and set us in a direction that might lead to some constructive research and actions in the future. And I rather hope that you can do that in 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Thank you very much for having me in this really interesting conference, and I very much appreciated the summary which has been given by our rapporteur of the interesting contributions that have been heard since yesterday. My main point is to say that prioritizing socially sensitive sectors for competition is clearly, I would say, a consensus move, but it is part of a wider movement. In order for this prioritization to be useful and successful, we have to change the mindset of competition economic analysis. We have to change, to a certain extent, the instruments of competition authorities. We have to change the relationship between competition authorities and other policymakers, economic policymakers, and we have to change the institutional arrangements of cooperation. So let me just go over this rapidly in the time which has been allotted to me. I share a lot of what has been said so I share a lot of the questions which have been raised during those 2 days. It reminds me of a time not very long ago when a competition authority asked itself, am I relevant? The answer was, do my decisions meet the standards of competition economics? And that was it. Okay, so the relevance was defined with respect to theoretical consideration. We've moved to a world where, because of the various crises which have been alluded to, there are 4 questions which have come to the fore. The first one is whether the goals of competition law should go a little bit beyond the consumer welfare as traditionally defined in competition economics, and be a more general goal with a wider set of stakeholders, such as labor, small and medium-sized suppliers, etc. The second questioning has been the questioning of the relevance of economic analysis. We have discovered that economic analysis could be, or at least the traditional competition analysis, could be very limited in a number of areas. First of all, it assumes labor mobility, and we know for a fact that neither geographically nor professionally there is much mobility of labor, hence the fact that international trade is not always a win-win proposition. There is no clear answer in economic or in competition economics on the question of innovation and competition. Okay, there's a variety of answers, but what we should do with those answers is not at all clear. There's not much clarity on the relationship between conglomerate power and market power either. And for a long time, conglomerate power was just ignored. Well, we know, particularly in the digital sector, that it may be a source of market power, and the relationship between conglomerate and market power has to be explored. We don't know why some firms win the competition game and others fail. And we're not all that interested. We just assume that the one that failed did not maximize profits or were unable to do it. But there is another strand of literature, which comes from business strategy, and which is the economic analysis of business strategy, that probably has a lot to offer to competition analysis. The third level of questioning is a questioning of the legitimacy of private economic power. I think there is a general shift compared to the 1990s or the 1980s, where there was a very wide consensus on the fact that private economic power was more desirable than public power. Since then, we have seen other market failures or public policy issues that came to the fore, and that may require more leeway for governments or for competition authorities to intervene. And finally, there's been a question about the adequacy of our instrument, competition law enforcement. And in some areas, it seems to be very slow and very costly, really, to achieve what we would like. Okay, so if we move forward, what is the new antitrust mindset? Well, to go a little bit beyond the exercise of market power and possibly to explore issues which are linked to economic power, the relationship between market power and political power, for example, through access. Second, to go a little bit beyond the economic goal of maximizing consumer welfare, to enlarge the number of stakeholders in the competitive game. One of the noticeable things about competition economics is that it treats all consumers the same, irrespective of whether you're rich, educated, healthy, or poor, uneducated, and sick. You always play the same role, and competition economics doesn't make any distinction between those. Well, it just happened that the people who are uneducated, immobile, sick, etc., and generally fragile have less opportunities to benefit from competitive markets than others. And that therefore the competitive game, it does not distribute its benefit across all categories. So we want to include some notions of equality and inclusiveness in our analysis. We have to go beyond the short-term perspective, because we're faced with and the static perspective, because we're faced with digital sector that is technological revolution. So we have to consider innovation more often than we used to, and we have to consider both the resilience and the sustainability of our economies, which are long-term issues and not necessarily only short-term. Okay. Now, finally, we have to be modest, and I think this was mentioned by Alice, in the sense that competition is clearly a necessary part of a wider set of complementary policies if we want to achieve our goals. So the relationship between competition policy and other policies has to be strengthened, and that includes, indeed, industrial policy, trade policy, anti-corruption, education, etc. Now, the traditional instrument that we have at our disposal are the sanctions for antitrust violation or merger control, but there are two instruments that we've already started using: prioritization cases and advocacy. Now, new instrument probably would allow us a faster intervention and a deeper intervention to prevent violations rather than to cure violations after the facts, because that cure takes a long time to come. And we can see across the world that competition authorities are acquiring all those new tools: market investigation, interim measures, commitment decisions, the ability to produce codes of conduct. All those are more regulatory instruments that can be used by competition authorities to get better results, particularly in the new perspective which I have outlined. The final point is that we have two major issues, if not three, that require a reset of cooperation among competition authorities. One of them is climate change, which is obviously a global problem. The second one is the digital sector, which is obviously a global issue. The third one is economic progress in general and growth. So we need to be less individualistic and to cooperate more, and in particular, to cooperate on the agenda of our enforcement agencies, which we haven't done in the past. We have cooperated on the solutions to our cases, but not much on the agenda. We need to tackle these issues at a global level, and for this, we need new tools of cooperation. That's what I wanted to say.
And you said it in a very, very positive and effective way, Fred. I wonder, though, if when you next sit as chair of the competition of the OECD Competition Policy Committee, you might give them a précis of what you've just said then as something to think about. I think it's at that level that we need policymakers and practitioners to start to put into effect some of these things. We'll move pretty well straight away now to a slight change from the program order, and that Thembakosi Monakeli is going to speak to us next.
Thank you very much for inviting me to make some reflection in this very powerful and big panel, I should say. I think Fred has stolen words from my mouth, really. And I'm tempted to just to say I agree with the OECD. It speaks like a BRICS country. No, I won't. I mean, it's true that from a developing country point of view, these issues of equity are much more pronounced. In my own country, the competition authority has to constantly search for relevance in an environment where, understandably, the objective of ending poverty, inequality, and unemployment is the #1 priority. So you can't go to government, to parliament, and to society and define yourself outside of this objective. But I think that if these areas were regarded as tensions before, there are many lessons to draw from how the global community has to respond to issues of sustainability, because sustainability issues are outside the traditional efficiency consideration of competition authorities. But we're seeing increasingly consensus that if we ignore this, we would ignore it at our own peril. It's a societal challenge that even the purists of purists cannot ignore. So I think that that gives us a lot of lessons about, you know, the capacity of competition thinkers to grapple with these crises that Fred spoke about. The second issue is that I know that he's spoken about the digital economy and platforms, a topic that we covered also in the past 2 days here. The only thing I want to say about this is it seems to me that developing countries need to define an agenda in this area. It's still very undefined. And I think the ex-ante regulation does present some lessons for us, but we cannot afford to leave this area in a vacuum. After all, these are global markets and they affect consumers everywhere. I think thirdly, we have to revisit the issue around food and agriculture. It's an area that's also hugely impacted by technology and innovation that requires that we relook at these markets. And I think that I did say in the panel that I think, Alexei, we probably need to revisit the food value chains study that was done in 2017. I think that it might be a little outdated, but it is still most relevant today, in my view. Of course, there are new issues around food. We have to get our competition agencies to be able to respond in time, and in time is my emphasis, to issues of inflation. Inflation is not a very stable thing. You know, it's there for a certain period of time. And if you are going to respond to it after 12 months, that response often will be irrelevant. So I agree that we probably need to redesign our tools. It's better for the competition agencies that have a consumer protection mandate. I think they can respond better. But the competition agencies that still use the traditional competition tools, I think need to rethink how to respond, because I think inflation is here to stay from time to time, that is. And then there's an issue of healthcare, a topic also that was covered quite a lot. The only thing I want to say about healthcare is we of course have to treat it in a special way, because traditionally healthcare access is a human rights issue. That is, the assumption is governments provide access, guarantee access of its citizens. But increasingly, healthcare is being provided by private healthcare providers. And I think Fred has already placed the issue of private power vis-a-vis public power. And I think we have to find new ways of thinking about health care. I want to say, though, in conclusion, that with all of these, we shouldn't abandon the old-fashioned competition tools. Cartels are still the enemy of consumers, the enemy of the poor. And in all of these new things we are talking about, I have a real frustration sometimes that people think that we should take our eyes off enforcement against cartels, doing a proper measure analysis, doing a proper abuse of dominance enforcement case. Those traditional tools are still very, very important and fundamental to our work. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I'm going to dash and leave early.
Well, thank you for those rather sharp comments too. I mentioned to Fred that at his next session of the OECD Competition Policy Committee that he should go over some of his remarks. And then I heard you saying that it's time for the Global South to do a bit of coordinating on what might be the content of the new competition policy. Well, it turns out that later this week, you'll have the opportunity, and as the rest of us who are staying will, to try and influence some at the BRICS meeting. And so I think I wonder if I could turn back on you, your suggestion, and see if you can plant for those officials who are already here and amongst those that we'll meet some of these ideas and get some work underway at the BRICS organization to do just the things that you spoke of. I think that would be a marvelous way of carrying the legacy of this conference forward. And that won't be the last of such suggestions, because I'll wait for Teresa to finish her comments before giving her a charge for UNCTAD as well. But while Teresa is getting ready to speak, I wonder if we could bring up her slides, please.
Thank you very much. I think it may be a little bit too much for the audience to still have slides, but it was also an attempt to draw the surviving elements of this very interesting but very intense and full conference, a way to also get a little bit more distraction, so to speak. I will be very brief. I think it's very difficult to add anything just after hearing Fred, but of course, Tembin gave the perspective of developing countries. You all know. Next slide, please. So I will be brief, just picking up on things that I myself mentioned and others have mentioned. Frankly, I wanted to start with, again, the Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because they were agreed by all the UN member states, and very interestingly, by regional, international organizations. I remember 5 years ago, I was in Japan for a G20 International Consumer Conference, and the Confederation of Japanese Industries had little pins with the symbol of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I was very impressed and mentioned this publicly, and they were very impressed that I had mentioned it. But again, this is a collective effort. Now, it is true that they don't encompass everything. For instance, consumer protection as such, despite our attempts. At that time, UNCTAD still did not have a formal mandate, is not fully there. But next slide, please. I would like especially to mention the SDG 10, reduce inequalities, which I think is extremely relevant to the discussion. And it's really a cross-cutting issue. It was already a cross-cutting issue, but of course, I think since the pandemic and this polity crisis that followed, I think it's more relevant than ever. Next slide, please. I wanted to say or to remind everybody that the United Nations set of principles and rules on competition, which again remains the only agreed multilateral instrument despite being an ensemble of recommendations, thus encompass this development dimension. That means to say it recommended developing countries to adopt and implement competition law and policy, recognizing their legitimacy to do so according to their specific circumstances. So from my point of view, in a way, and along these lines, competition law and policy, especially for developing countries, could already encompass what we could consider strictly non-economic objectives. And again, I talk about the public interest clause of South Africa, but which of course it has a restrictive nature, etc. But there have been a lot of other legislations that have temporarily adopted exempted sectors of activity because they were strategic, because they were in the process of development, etc. That is one example. Another example I wanted to give is the one of the European legislation, because interestingly, the European Commission and its member states continue to enforce two provisions that have the same wording since the then European communities were launched. And this has allowed the European Commission and its member states very much influence, and that can also apply these provisions directly, to really grasp changes, evolutions of the economic context. Okay, then you can tell me about the Digital Markets Act of the European Union, which shows that not everything on Earth can actually be grasped. But this is to make the point that in any case, from my point of view, competition law and policy already had this capacity, so to speak. Of course, it will depend on the priorities of competition authorities, and Fred mentioned prioritization, but I think that was already there. Next slide, please. I just wanted a little bit already as a suggestion to offer that not only competition law and policy has spread across the world. Of course, I could say that the UN played a very important role, and I do believe so before my time in UNCTAD, as most of you will know. But of course, the OECD, the World Bank, even the IMF now talking a lot about competition these days, regional organizations, academia, bilateral cooperation. Next slide, please. So all of these led to a situation, next slide, please, where we saw regional economic organizations. This is blocked. Thank you. We have seen the proliferation of competition as a regional important issue for organizations that gather developing countries. And I think this is extremely interesting, Alan, because this really provides fora for discussion of also how to implement and the road ahead, since UNCTAD has 195 countries, and it is very, very difficult, of course, to discuss with countries, to consult, hence regional groupings. And through regional economic organizations, I think there is a fantastic way of small and young and less resourced and less experienced competition authorities to be able not only to learn, but also to jointly discuss and launch actions, initiatives, issue recommendations, etc. Next slide, please. This will be very quickly now. Next slide. In any case, it's about the global challenges, which encompass a little bit what was already mentioned by several, by all panels. So digital markets, sustainability, something that only Fred mentioned a little bit, and I do believe it's something that. Next slide, please. This is just our pledge for regional cooperation at every level. Next slide, when possible. But I was talking about cross-border enforcement cooperation. And I think this is extremely relevant both for digital markets as for the sustainability challenges. But frankly, even to harness the polity crisis, because what we heard about food, what we heard about energy, these are very common challenges, of course, not necessarily with a specific same impact in all areas of the world, but still common challenges because these all happen at the same time. Next slide, please. So I wanted to mention this, and regarding developing countries, also important challenges that were touched upon these 2 days. So the rise of state intervention in the economy that started with the pandemic, that went on due to the polity crisis, but which really requires that fantastic advisory role of competition authorities to be more enhanced than ever, to ensure that there will be an end of the crisis. And when the crises end or are phasing out, there will be pro-competitive solutions and not just a sort of crystallization of nationalization of key companies or interventions to rescue strategic enterprises, this type of situation that we have seen actually in developed countries. So let alone developing countries. And also issues such as the weight of state-owned enterprises. Next slide, please. Could you just now pass them? Thank you. So the weight of state-owned enterprises, competitive neutrality, which I think is extremely relevant for developing countries and frankly, to middle-income countries within the broad range of developing countries. And of course, sectors such as healthcare that were already mentioned here. Please go on. Thank you. I think we're very easily next. I think you can get to the really final slide. I wanted to say that from our point of view and picking up exactly, we're on some issues that I mentioned that UNCTAD has recommended and suggested. Some were already mentioned both by Fred and Tembin. These elements. So as I said, this need for an holistic approach. I think there is a role definitely for competition law and policy in what regards all these challenges, even those that are not immediately driven by strict economic reasons. What I think is that there is a plethora of other public policies that need to be used in conjunction. And we should not necessarily think that everything should be conferred or resolved by competition authorities or through competition law and policy. Then, of course, the multi-stakeholder approach and this idea of a participatory process, which requires contributions, but a conscious and a fluid and fruitful engagement with civil society organizations, with academia, but also with business. I do think that regulation, co-regulation is maybe not my pet issue, but I'm a big believer in self-regulation because I've seen in the consumer protection side how this has been very helpful to promote a more friendly consumer culture, and that is extremely important. And I want to say, because somebody mentioned this today, UNCTAD does work on the voluntary sustainability standards, and it is amazing to see developing countries, companies in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, really adhering to these principles. This is a contribution to promote sustainability. It's not just through competition law and policy. And because I think I'm taking too long. So the importance, of course, of collaboration and cooperation within jurisdictions and between, of course, all stakeholders. And I think that there should be, frankly, and here you'll ask me, why don't you do this yourself? I mean, or your organization? I think international organizations and regional organizations should have more leadership in proposing solutions that are appropriate, global solutions for global challenges, as we say. UNCTAD has the benefit of offering the largest platform, so we welcome others, and I commit ourselves to that work. Thank you.
So you've saved me the task of committing you to it. But what I will say is that I think one of the greatest policy failures during the whole period of globalization was the failure of international consumer protection and competition agencies to finally get together, to cooperate on information sharing, on cross-border investigations, enforcement. We've seen 25 years of largely uncontrolled international activity. The OECD, of course, and International Competition Network have done a lot of work, but so much of that has been about streamlining procedures and not all that much about more effective enforcement. So I think one of the takeaway messages, and that while it's not for the Secretariat of UNCTAD to tell members what to do, but I do hope that in inviting people to the IGEs next year, you might encourage them to focus on some of those issues and perhaps to give a bit of an account of how they might be approaching some of these issues that we've been describing here. But delighted in your presentation, Teresa, as we will be to hear from Eleanor Fox, who is online, I'm sure, and we'd invite her for a 10-minute intervention as well. So are you there, Eleanor?
Yes, I am here. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this really very comprehensive, important program. And I also have to draw a lot from my colleagues on the panel because I do agree with your perspectives. I would like to make the following contribution. I think we are in a crisis in antitrust, and I think the developed world has let antitrust down. And many of the things that I'm going to say, which I think need to be done for the developing world, the developed world can learn from. And having put it in that context, let me just start with certain limits of US antitrust law, US being one of the two biggest models in the world and very influential, for example, in ICN. Some of the limits of the US law that should absolutely not be replicated and should be overturned in developing countries, but also should feed back to the developed world. So number one, US antitrust law has no distributive values in it. It is allocative. It is not distributive. Number two, it does not recognize excessive pricing as a violation. And number three, it incorporates presumptions of what we can call Chicago School neoliberalism, assuming markets work well. Therefore, it does not have, and you could say rejects, an idea of inclusivity. All three of those principles must find sort of the opposite in developing countries, and I would hope even feedback to the developed. So let me start with an idea of the core of antitrust, and this being particularly addressed to the developing countries, but I think should apply to all. I want to say a word about the core, a word about complementaries, and a word about some conflicts. And I say this because you've just had at your conference so many different issues. It seems like so many different issues that are vital, demand attention. And one could think kind of scattershot that there's this, there's that, there's this balance, this trade-off. And I want to say that most of those issues and problems, or at least a huge part of them, come within what should be the core foundation of thinking about competition law, not a balancing problem. And that includes inclusivity of those without power and those who have been left out. Competition law should have that as a core foundational value, so that it should always be looking at access and possibilities for entry, and not be satisfied with the idea, oh, there are 5, 6 companies in the market, that's fine for competition. Thinking about poverty, that's a huge point on core. Antitrust should be able at the core to think about what is needed for food for the hungry, to prevent people from starving. And here, as Tembi said, don't forget hardcore cartels against the most vulnerable are probably the most common cartels and the most pervasive cartels, and could help the poorest live and have food on the table. And also, for farmers, for example, be part of the profession of the picture. Also at the core is labor markets. Workers, small suppliers should not be exploited in ways that are against antitrust laws, and there are a lot of ways. They are part of the market chain, the suppliers, the buyers. This, incidentally, is recognized even in developed countries today, and many people put it into what they call consumer welfare, although I think that term is much too narrow. But it is, to the extent it is a market problem, it is part of the core of what antitrust does and should do. For example, antitrust should be preventing employers from agreeing not to pay more to their employees. Being conscious of the poor and pro-poor population and the left-out population belongs in the core vision of antitrust. Also being conscious, I want to say a word about inequalities. There's a sense in which the inequality problem comes directly into the core. We know that as industries get more concentrated, as firms get more power, the markets themselves are going to distribute the lion's share of everything to the rich and to the elite. And antitrust has a huge role, a central role to play in limiting market power and abuse of market power. So I propose that the core be, and also working towards green markets that will work effectively. So the core I'm talking about is actually not saying we care about equity, not efficiency. It is saying efficiency is a word that has been monopolized by the developed countries to mean something very specific that does not include inclusivity. the developing countries should be looking at equity issues in terms of what makes their markets more efficient for their people, for their left out people, especially for solving the hunger and food problem. And it is a symbiosis between equity and efficiency rather than a bargaining, a trading off. When you're outside of the core, there are various complementary issues, and some of them are not in conflict. And you've all mentioned this. I mean, for example, some of the sustainability problems are complementary to the core of what antitrust does and can work side by side without any trade-off. The fact that jurisdictions are now considering 5 minutes, I think, and I have a few more. Think of Bayer Monsanto, for example, a mega merger, lots of anti-competitive problems, lots of environmental problems. The environmental problems should be raised side by side the competition problems. In my view, if developing countries were at that world table from day one with developed, that merger would have been stopped, mostly for competition reasons, also for environmental reasons. Then there is the trade-off area, and I just suggest that one should be careful about this, that one shouldn't slip easily into saying, we have a sustainability problem here, let's bypass antitrust, because most collaborations that include being good for the environment are not anti-competitive and would not be prohibited. And if one does the proper competition law analysis, there's then a much smaller area in which you might want to make an exception. If you really trust the firms that are collaborating, which is a big question, to do what is good for the economy, this is basically an issue for regulation and other people to make the decision. So I've mentioned core and complementary and trade-offs. I want to say a word about institutionalism. I agree with a lot that Frederick has just said, but he's also said elsewhere about answering the question, are our institutions fit for dealing with the problems before us, and particularly the huge problems before developing countries that need to be solved now and not 10 years from now? And an answer is they're not totally fit. And one reason is the complexity of economics that we've allowed to creep into the law, which lengthens the cases and helps lengthen them for 10 years till they get decided. It's very important to have much simpler economics, more generalizations of economics, and we may need to go to more ex-ante regulation or simpler rules, or the problems do not get solved, and they do not get solved in time. In addition, and I draw from Frederick a lot also, but others of you have mentioned, like Teresa has mentioned, better cooperation cross-border, better regional. These are big challenges, but the close neighbor cooperation is more doable, practical, and foreseeable in the very short term. And the cooperation cross-border should include competition and trade and competition problems that prevent the good flow. So in closing, I would say there is a huge challenge. And one challenge is getting a common voice. For developing countries, for example, to have a common voice and to stand up to some very restrictive, sort of pro-neoliberal impulses of the West, unless there is one way, almost one way, of putting together the issues, talking about what needs to be done on inclusivity, pro-poor, for example, there will not be as much traction. So this is one thing I do propose, getting together a common voice. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think, Eleanor, there is a role for you in that process as well. And I'm foreseeing your next book about these very things. I think you would be an ideally placed person to, with that academic rigor that you bring to this matter, to try and help us group some of these issues, the ones that you called core and others, and that I hope you'll consider, if not an actual book, then perhaps a longer form essay that might be used as for thought leadership around the competition community. So thank you very much indeed for that. And we move now to another virtual participant, virtual only in this conference. Sothi Ratchagan is in other respects completely real and not virtual. So I'd like to invite Sothi to give us his 10 minutes of erudition.
Thank you, Alan. First of all, let me congratulate the organizing team for putting together another excellent conference. And of course, thanking them also for inviting me to be part of the valedictory session. The problem I have, of course, is that to do a valedictory session without having attended the whole of the conference poses problems. But I do have a particular issue that I would like to focus on, and I hope I do not repeat some of the things that were said during each of the sessions. Let me begin also by congratulating Pradeep and Kats for their advocacy work. They bring the reality of the lives of the disadvantaged to global context, and I say thank you. Whenever a consumer welfare issue bothers me, I send a WhatsApp message to Pradeep, which he graciously acknowledges. And I'm often delighted to see it subsequently reflected in some of the work of Kats. My latest message to Pradeep was on healthcare and the biased media attacks on producers of generic medicines. Now, given the very limited time, I shall confine my comments to the issue of access to vaccines and the need of civil society to refocus on equitable access to healthcare. We have just come out, or are still in the midst of a pandemic. 770 million cases, 7 million deaths, many unemployed, lost their incomes. The pharma companies have made extreme profits. Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, Sinovac made something like USD $90 billion in profits for 2021 and 2022. During the pandemic, governments funded billions of dollars to support vaccine research and development. 7 vaccine producers are reported to have received at least USD 5.8 billion in public funding. And the agreements, it is claimed, do not require a return of the funds, not even when large profits are made. In addition, the pharmaceutical companies received funding to the tune of USD 86.5 billion by way of advanced purchase agreements for development and production. In the scramble to secure the vaccines, developed countries made a grab. Duke University's Global Health Innovation Center data indicates that Canada, for instance, purchased 10 doses for each of its citizens, the most for any country on a per-person basis. So the high prices and the grab of available vaccine doses led to what Jaishankar Subramaniam told the UN General Assembly. It led to a system of vaccine apartheid. And this is backed up by data that is presented in Our World in Data. As of yesterday, 70.5% of the world's population had received at least 1 dose of a vaccine, but in low-income countries, only 32.6% had received 1 dose. Now, ladies and gentlemen, vaccine suppliers imposed non-disclosure clauses, which permitted local corporations to also be involved in price gouging. In Malaysia, Pharmaniaga, a privatized government entity, is alleged to have even charged higher prices to 6 state governments than it did to the federal government. Differential pricing determined by only the corporations and without transparency is a recipe for corruption at several levels. There must be a transparent, equitable formula for differential pricing. if it is to serve the objective of ensuring supply to the most vulnerable. Vaccines, of course, lead to side effects, especially so experimental vaccines. With COVID-19 vaccines, long-term debilitation and even death occurred. These were often glibly attributed to pre-existing conditions. The corporations had imposed a no liability clause, which some governments even expressed in their own laws. Those affected, therefore, have had to rely on the public health system, and where this is not available, have had to fend for themselves. In 2020, of course, India and South Africa co-sponsored TRIPS waiver proposal. But this proposal did not gain WTO consensus because many developed countries opposed it. The Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance even issued a joint declaration characterizing the proposal to override intellectual property rights as divisive. They repeated the industry mantra of the importance of IP rights for sustainable vaccine manufacture. The WTO did adopt a ministerial decision in June 2022, but it merely permitted developing country members to export vaccines they manufactured to other developing countries. The waiver also only covered vaccine technology and not therapeutics and tests. This waiver was very little and very late. Now to the urgent point. There is an intergovernmental negotiating body for a WHO instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The negotiations are at an advanced stage, and the plan is to be able to submit the final outcome to the 77th World Health Assembly in May 2024. In parallel to this process, negotiations are also ongoing to amend the international health regulations as last revised in 2005. The regulations is currently the only binding instrument on pandemic preparedness and response. And it does not regulate the development and distribution of medical products necessary to address pandemics. The working group undertaking this negotiation is also aimed to conclude by 2024. So that's the urgency. The job is being done. It will be completed. We'll have to worry about whether there is any possibility of influencing that at this stage. The vaccine discussions and the amendments to international health regulations must guarantee and facilitate rapid and unimpeded access to all vulnerable groups. For this, there needs to be binding rules that institutionalize solidarity and equity. During the pandemic, the vulnerable, be it the aged, the poor, or displaced communities were neglected, both in developed and less developed countries. Equitable intra-state distribution of health resources is the state responsibility, and this must be reflected in the outcomes of the WHO deliberations. There also needs to be a redress mechanism for people who suffer severe adverse effects. This cannot be funded by low-income countries. A vaccine supplier-funded no-fault compensation scheme needs to be established to enable that those who suffer side effects are supported. The international negotiating body began with a promising zero draft. That draft, though, has been whittled down during the successive rounds of discussions. A few of the provisions drafted as shall will provide concrete mandates. Most of them just aim to promote, encourage, incentivize, urge, make all possible efforts, endeavor to consider implementing. Overall, the new draft resembles more a declaration, a statement of intention and loose commitments, rather than a legally binding instrument. In fact, the European Union appears to have begun preparations for the next pandemic on the basis that the current situation will not change. On 30th June 2023, the European Union's Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority announced that it had reached a framework contract with 4 contractors, including Pfizer, for mRNA vaccines to guarantee a fast response to future health crises.
So, do you have any suggestions that
Yes, I
relate
do.
to the
Yes, I
WTO ministerial next year?
Yeah. Yes. My point is that the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has revealed in rapid motion what healthcare delivery always is. Healthcare inflation is significantly higher, general inflation certainly, then public sector funding of R&D is not reflected in the price of medications, etc. So the general point is, with healthcare choices, we determine who lives and who will die. There was a time when civil society involvement and dialogue on healthcare was significant, but this appears to have been supplanted by interest groups with industry support. It is necessary for civil society to reassert its influence. Consumer welfare requires a strong civil society participation in the dialogue for fair, equitable healthcare. I hope that CUTS will provide the leadership to establish a network of civil society groups to undertake this task. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. And just as you've been sending WhatsApp messages to Pradeep, I think you should keep an eye on your device, because you might find Pradeep sending you a WhatsApp message seeking some support in developing some of your arguments, both for the World Health Assembly and for the WTO ministerial next year. These are organizations that play an important role in this, and that it's been the subject of a lot of our conversation here today. Moving right along then to Augustine Peter, and it's a delight, Augustine, to have you here with your experience from the Competition Commission and now in your regulatory law practice. Augustine.
Thank you very much. I'll be going just straight to the points which you had indicated. First of all, prioritizing the sensitive sectors. We have discussed substantively during the last 2 days regarding SDGs, sustainability, in particular SDGs. I find that we have to prioritize first the countries or regions, and second, the SDGs in particular. Because we have seen UN Secretary General yesterday, he was quoted that we are far behind, especially the marginalized countries, LDCs, and small economies. So we have to prioritize. So I prioritize as poverty elimination, primary or quality education, primary health, and maybe I think I don't know what is the exact the rural road, especially legal transportation. These are the areas. For example, the East Asian Miracle. You must have all read that book by World Bank, 1997, I think, when the East Asian Miracle happened. That time. So there they have highlighted how primary education can alone trigger the whole development process in a community, in a country. This has been vindicated by further number of studies, especially education of girl child. When a girl in a family gets educated, the whole family gets educated. As a mother, she will be able to just nurture the entire family. So girls' education, primary education in particular. Second, primary health. Primary health is extremely important. That transforms the society. Third, as we were telling, is about sanitary water, drinking water facilities. So I think now coming to the priority countries, marginalized countries, small economies, LDCs, and low-income economies with limited capabilities. India is a low-income country, but with capabilities which may not be requiring attention, prioritization like that. Now, we have a concept how to address what is the issue, why things are not moving. There have been estimates that per year, $1.44 trillion are required if we have to meet the SDG targets in the case of developing countries as a whole. In the case of the prioritized countries, which I am telling, they require $500 billion if you want to reach the target. So Indonesian presidency, I along with Arun Nair, we presented a paper as part of T20, that is Think Tank 20. That is about blended finance. We argued that blended finance is important, but complementary resources are equally important, more important. Finance is important, but other complementary. So we argued that blended finance, why finance itself is not forthcoming, because finance at a cost, market prices may be coming, but to SDGs it will not come because of the risk factor. So how to make it risk-free? So we envisaged a system whereby there should be a blended resources rather than blended finance. Finance can be brought in by way of, there are certain types of finance which is just free. That is by finance by philanthropies, for example. Finance by international agencies which are giving ODA or government support. All these brought together. Second, other complementary resources. So I am not going to go into very much into the details of that, but bring them together as a blended resource, make it available to these countries. There should be a system. We also argued that there should be a multilateral fora platform, maybe under World Bank, but at a lower cost. So it's and we say the system. This I would suggest that because it was appreciated, but it was not followed up. So that was now coming to, I think, the second issue related to competition and sustainability. It's an important issue which has been discussed. So here I should congratulate Cuts for bringing this concept of efficiency versus equity. Here, is there any meeting point? There is certainly. Because I immediately was thinking in terms of, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Is that type of dichotomy existing here? No. There is possibility for bringing these two together. Here we have to also distinguish between policy and law. Policy is very easy. It is all comprehensive. When it comes to law, yes, law is based on efficiency. So that's the point which everybody has been mentioned. But at the same time, because I was a project appraiser, hardly anybody may be knowing that the Delhi Metro project was appraised by me when I was in planning commission. Then when the financial appraisal was made, which is equivalent to the efficiency angle, we found that it was hundreds and hundreds into negative return. When we added economic efficiency criteria, economic return, then it came closer to becoming viable. When we added social benefits, it came even to the point of workable. So it was approved by the government, and it's now you see the Delhi Metro, which is off. So this type of issue can be built into the area of competition as well. Because in European law, I think 101 clause 3, and here in India, that is section 33 proviso, talks about efficiency enhancing cooperation or joint venture, which then how do you measure efficiency? We have to bring that type of a system into place so that efficiency can be measured, as well as you bring in the benefits accruing to the consumers in a different way. For example, public goods, I think we have already indicated during the discussion. But at the same time, while bringing in equity, are you going to kill efficiency? That should not happen. The more you give birth to the child should not disappear. So the issue is how to balance. That requires that there should be well defined, because I think in the case of COMESA, it was indicated that yes, the discretion is to the Competition Commission members. That is disastrous. It has to be well defined how the equity aspect is to be building. Otherwise, we will see the natural death of competition law based on efficiency.
Do you have some action points for us?
Is it the time?
It is.
Okay. So I think I stop here.
Thank you.
This is my action.
Well, and they've been great, and they've been great action points, as is that one. So I'd like to invite Alexei Ivanov now to speak, and as with Teresa, you may well anticipate my suggestion to you at the end, so you might wish to incorporate that.
So I think it's a very important actually task to avoid the death of competition law, either natural or by some sort of accident. And as Eleanor was saying, that in the developed countries they failed to avoid this, and to a certain extent it did disappear kind of from real actual political toolkit which countries operate to deal with this poly crisis and other social issues. So maybe developing countries which relatively recently took this tool, whatever analogy could be used, like sword or better some sort of more advanced technological device, and using this tool to solve the social problems and economic problems of really high magnitude and enormous urgency and pressure. And I think we have everything at the moment to adjust antitrust for the current economic and social environment. And I think we have enough in terms of resources, we have enough in terms of political will, we have enough in terms of expertise. Maybe what we're missing and lacking is some sort of, kick-starting, process or, energy, which would convert all this potential energy we have into dynamic into the process. And what we observe here is how this, crystallization happening, and maybe we are actually observing this moment which will change the mindset. I couldn't agree more with Frederick that mindset of antitrust, not only lawyers and economists, but also antitrust, let's say, advocates within political class. I mean, those people who support and promote competition law tools should be changed. So antitrust should become more relevant to dealing with the current issues, and that's a very huge thing. I think it could be a game changer in certain instances, considering that we do have a methodology of SGDs. I mean, as Yelena was saying today at the afternoon session, SGDs principles, SGDs are based on certain, system approach, and this system approach could be developed and more by 2030 when we have to, change SGDs with something else. So maybe this methodology could be slowly but steadily incorporated by antitrust principles, but antitrust presumptions, but antitrust practice enforcement. And definitely we need to get together to deal with these global issues. That's very clear. But I think one of the barrier to get together, and one of the barrier to actually establish this new methodology and new life, to give new life to antitrust, is actually kind of a fear of failure people are scared to make, experimentalists to make some moves and steps which could not lead to immediate, success and and result. And this is like a fear of experimentation. That's something we have to address, with something we have to deal with. So I think we have to bring more experimentalist type of, thinking and mentality into our actual life, and work of people doing antitrust in different capacities and on different platforms. But actually, this experimentalist spirit, I think it was kind of fading away during, this period of Washington Consensus, and in a way, like people were, relatively relaxed, thinking that everything is clear. We have just applied certain rules. And that's how we ended up with this type of failure, or as Augustine said, like a natural death of antitrust as we knew it. But I do think that experimentalist spirit can come back. I think it can come back. It is coming back. And because it's always with us. We just need to release it and to let it go. And one of the things through which this experimentalist, spirit can come through is like diversity. When we really embrace diversity, not in a manner like multiculturalist approach was built in the West, which really also failed to a large extent. But diversity in its, complexity, and with all this, really different forms of existence of life. As we have a good bunch of Italians in the room, actually, the best represented developed country at this conference. And I remember one very famous Florentine guy, Dante Alighieri, was saying, I didn't read in Italian, but I read English translation. There was one line there, that God delights in diversity. That was mentioned there. I don't remember which part. I think it was in the paradise part. Yeah. So, but I'm sure God does delight in diversity, and I think this diversity you have to embrace it more, like to be a little bit less rigid, allow ourselves to fail sometimes, to do mistakes, but move further and understand, that others people can think differently, act differently, and that's okay. That's very good, actually. So through this experimentalist spirit, diversity, we can build better antitrust. Like, new things coming out of cows. Cows produce, nature and their order. So we need a little bit of cows now. We have plenty of it in other places, but let's have it a little bit of antitrust then. And then out of these cows, we can create a new order, which would be more successful, I hope. New life to be born. Thank you very much.
And it follows that your forum is one that can play an important part in some of these things, to share some of these ideas, to evaluate them in a critical way, and look at ones that are worth taking forward. And I hope that we can link up with you again, finding ways of supporting that. And I think that there's much that can be achieved in that way. So let's move now to Thomas Cheng.
Good evening, everyone. I think we're getting very close to the end of the conference, so I will keep my comments short. First, because you've already heard me earlier, and secondly, because we have such an esteemed panel with Frederick and Eleanor and Teresa. I think we should save some time to hear from them instead. So every party has a party pooper. So I'm going to be the party pooper here, but not as much of a party pooper as, say, the Joker in Batman, because first of all, I'm not as good an actor as Joaquin Phoenix, and secondly, my message is not as subversive as his. But what I would like to, we have spent the last day and a half talking about a variety of things, access to medicine, access to food, sustainability, and digital economy. And clearly, the drive is towards expanding the mandate of competition law, extending the purview of competition law. And clearly, the direction is towards a multi-purpose view of competition law. And I think the debate between whether competition law should only be about a single purpose of consumer welfare, economic efficiency, or whether it should encompass a variety of objectives. I think we probably have already won that debate, at least outside of the US. I think there are still a few people who would argue that antitrust law should only be concerned with economic efficiency and consumer welfare. And I think we deserve a pat on the shoulders on ourselves, because I remember when I started in academia about 15, 20 years ago, when you go to a conference and say competition law should at least consider fairness, you'd be probably laughed off the stage and no one would invite you to any conference again. And at least in the global north and in America in particular. But I think that is no longer true. And I think we've all accepted that competition law can and should consider more than economic efficiency, consumer welfare, and a number of other objectives. And but I would like to ask for, I guess, a bit of modesty. And I think also a focus on implementation. Because I think it is very easy for us to say, oh, competition law should do this, competition law should do that, but how? And I think we don't often go deeply enough into the implementation part to have a concrete roadmap as to how we are going to do it. And I mean, there are easy, low-hanging fruits, such as prioritization. I think no one would disagree that we should prioritize access to food, access to medicine, and as Eleanor mentioned earlier, poverty, inclusivity. These are clearly laudable objectives that no one can argue against. And prioritization is one way to achieve it, and no one can argue against in a developing country that we should prioritize sectors that have impact on poverty reduction. As Tenbin mentioned earlier, I don't think in any developing country you can practice competition law without a focus on that. But when we talk about concrete cases, how do we juggle between different objectives? Whenever people talk about, oh, we should pursue multiple objectives in competition law, my question, the question that comes up in my mind always is, so what do we do when the objectives conflict? We can think of the relationship between competition and a different objective, a non-economic objective, if you want to call it that, say sustainability, for example. We can conceptualize the relationship between competition and sustainability in the following way. And here I wish I prepared a PowerPoint, but I have not. In terms of, you can think of it as plus and minus. So that in two scenarios, competition and sustainability points in the same direction. So you could have a business practice that is both anti-competitive and environmentally destructive, or at least environmentally disadvantageous. So under both competition and environmental law, or at least sustainability, we would object to that and we would prohibit that. That's fine, no conflict. And there would be there could be also a business practice where both point in a positive direction. It is both pro-competitive and environmentally advantageous. So no conflict there. But the difficult cases are when the two do conflict. So what do we do? One situation is where it is environmentally negative, but pro-competitive, or at least competitively neutral. And in this case, I would argue that it is not really the role of competition law to, it is not really up to competition law to prohibit that practice, because it is really an environmental law issue. If the practice is pro-competitive or competitively neutral but environmentally harmful, we should leave it to environmental regulation to take care of that. And I think the truly difficult scenario is when it is anti-competitive, but it has environmental benefits. How do we do that? How do we, we talk about balancing, and the paradigmatic example of balancing is the rule of reason under the US antitrust. And a lot of you may also know that in reality, balancing is rarely done by US judges, because how do you balance? I mean, even in the context of pro-competitive benefits and anti-competitive effects, the balancing is hard enough. Balancing between competition, a competitive harm and environmental benefits, it would be very difficult for judges in advanced jurisdictions, even more difficult for developing country authority. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves in this particular situation, and I would suggest this is probably the most difficult scenario that we have to think about. And this is not just limited to sustainability. It also can apply to whatever objective we would like to pursue. What do we do? And I actually have an idea in mind, and I wrote about that in my book, but I think I don't want to pretend that I have the final answer to that, but I just want to raise the question for us to think about, and maybe we can discuss that afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's an intriguing point you make, but as people said earlier today, hardly a new one. This issue of balancing is something that's as old as some of our statutes, and that it occurs to me that many of us have worked in agencies that have both a consumer protection mandate as well as a competition mandate, and those who've grown up in that environment really don't see the problems that many others do. We're just so used to understanding competition as being a device for gaining increases in output and in efficiency and reductions of cost and an increase in diversity. But we've always known that that's only half, and not even the most significant half of the transaction. The other half is to ensure that those gains of all of those things are passed on to users. And not just users is the new paradigm, to other stakeholders. We need to consider the antecedents and consequences and things. And so in statutes similar to the one that I've grown up with from 1974, there were always some of these balancing provisions that have been used and tested in the courts over and over. I'm not wanting to minimize the problem that you raise, and that you're not such a party pooper as you think, but we are well reminded that when you start mixing objectives, you start to threaten achieving them, and I think that is a real challenge for academics and thought leaders. Now there's somebody who is going to be the recipient of not just the 50 presentations up till we started this session, but the 9 or 10 that have happened now too, and that's Navneet Sharma, and we're now going to hear from him, and I hope he's going to tell us just what he's going to do with all of this input, by when and how.
Well, I think that's of course the toughest, because not because I have to provide a recap or respond to so many action points. I'm very happy to state that we are going to be a team which will actually execute it. So Alan, you would agree that execution is going to be perhaps the toughest.
Yeah.
But it's our pleasant duty to undertake, to commit, to promise that we have meticulously, diligently taken note of all the action points. And don't worry, I am not going to bother you with an extensive summary all over. That has been already provided. And we have had great action points in this session. Very briefly, very crisply, I want to tell you that and through my brief remarks, I'm also proposing a vote of thanks. So that's my pleasant duty in this conference. This is a very nice culmination of about 9 to 10 months process since we started planning. And initial months of planning, conceptualizing, and last 4 or 5 months of active execution. So I must say this has been an excellent process of bringing one more exciting set of issues this year. And I keep wondering why we do it once in 2 years. I think it's quite a lot. It's already quite a lot. And we have a lot of action points for next 2 years. And also on that note, I must mention that we recently had a very exciting G20 conference. And there we had a very good statement, including some text on competition markets, digital markets, and so on, DPIs, and so on and so forth. From here, we go, the G20 train goes to Brazil and thereafter to South Africa. And right after this conference, next 3 days, we have BRICS conference. So therefore, I think there is an excellent momentum for next 2 years to really continue working. So that's something which should excite you, which should gladden your mind. Having said this, I must one more time touch upon that through these biennials, we have raised fundamental questions, forthcoming questions, futuristic questions about markets, competition, regulation, and development. On the objectives, Thomas, we've always thought, traditionally, it has been 16 years more actually, we have always thought that competition cannot be a narrow instrument. It's for the simple, commonsensical logic, since markets are at the bottom of all public policy, all economic functioning, how can competition be a side hero in this film? It is the hero. I mean, it's now for the governments to see how much space they want to really allocate to. So therefore, we have always thought it is very critical. In terms of the, of course, I am not, Mr. Augustine Peter has already prioritized. I need not repeat that. But overall, we see two themes here which emerge in our service to prioritize socially sensitive sectors. One theme is the tussle between state and markets. Last evening, Nagesh Kumar was referring to this. Sorry, not Nagesh Kumar. Rajat Kathuria mentioned, he referred to an Economist article on this in the current edition. And we see that states have last 3 years, 4 years particularly, not just COVID, but otherwise also through their industrial policy, they have demonstrated a tendency to expand. Now, how much to expand is again a design question. And we will continue to work with each one of you through our research, through our events, and we'll try to bring in some discipline that should market failure be the prima donna, the principal principle to inform the government decision. And here, if you allow me, I would like to mention very briefly the example of UPI in India, the digital payments. I mean, government has just extended its effort only to meet the limited market failure. Not really, it has refrained from being a player there. It has only created a nice little NPCI, National Payments Council of India, which is facilitating the limited market failure of connecting the dots. So therefore, that has allowed a lot of new market to develop, and everybody is able to equally participate in that. So having said this, I think we will continue to work on this theme of state versus market so that ultimately the socially sensitive sectors can be prioritized. So that's one thing I want to mention in summary. I also want to mention one more point, and which is in one line, I want to summarize the wisdom I have received this evening, that competition is a child which demands a village to be raised. If you allow this small little analogy, I would like to mention that, of course, competition authorities are important, no doubt. They enforce the law. But let's also not forget that the other government departments who work in order to create new markets, who create different set of rules and regulations and variety of things, Mr. Peter Augustine just mentioned about his experience at Planning Commission, that how he made an unviable project viable. Isn't it a work of competition policy? So therefore, all of the government departments also contribute very, very directly to competition policy. And I think this is an unfinished agenda, not just in India, elsewhere, but I think more work is needed so that competition can become market failure, competition, and proportionate, non-discriminate, and transparent policy action can take birth here at this juncture. So these are two substantive points which I take back as summary. And of course, one of the critical themes here, which we have always kept as a touchstone, is to keep our balance. Our Kutch biennials have kept this balance forever, always. So we have had industry speaking, regulators, government, researchers, lawyers, economists, international agencies, intergovernmental organizations. We have kept this balance, and we promise that we will keep it going forward. And therefore, that should raise your hope even further that we truly mean that we're going to follow it up on all the action points. Because this balance is our USP, and we wish to maintain it. And lastly, in terms of placing on record our sincere thanks, we have had competition. I'm not going to list all of them, don't worry. So we have had competition authority officials from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, everywhere, all over the world. We're extremely rich diversity. Thank you to each one of them. And of course, intergovernmental organization, our partners, UNCTAD, OECD, EUI, BRIC Center, and a large number of panels. You just counted the number. So therefore, I think it's a very, very collaborative effort where so many people come together to deliberate and structure the problem and provide solutions for us on a menu. I think it's a great service for each one of you, and our most sincere thanks to each one of you for having taken the trouble to travel and engage with the agenda and provide us extremely enriching insights, greatly valued. And all of this, let me also mention that by virtue of the virtual format and its broadcast on YouTube, it's going to remain there forever. So therefore, I hope all of you see the value of your hard work. It is a great value, which is going to inform not only the people who have directly participated, but thousands of individuals who are going to take these conversations into classrooms, into research labs, and everywhere. So there's a great value there. And lastly, I must mention that there's a great team, Kutch NCIRC team, under the leadership of Pradeep, and there's a good team which has. I want to mention that there is an extremely great deal of hard work done by or the team, particularly Woodville, who has led the effort here, and there's so many other members. And I want to recognize the hard work of all of them to make it happen. And with this, thank you very much, and we look forward to the next biennial.
Well, thank you for that. We haven't quite finished yet. We do need, though, at precisely or before 7 p.m. to vacate this room as it's being reconfigured for another event. But I am conscious that we've given you now another series of presentations, and that we do have time if there are some precise questions that people would like to direct to any of the panel members, and that if not, then I'll invite each of the panelists to a maximum 1 minute final comment. But first, is there anybody who'd like to direct a specific short question to one of the panelists? Or is everybody exhausted from that process? In which case, perhaps in reverse order then, I'll just invite final closing remarks. And Navneet, you can be first if you wish to say anything.
No, I think.
No, okay. Well, in fact, then
I will just say that despite the consensus about competition law and policy, and let's say in the current framework, so a competition law and policy looking forward, considering other goals and working in a more collaborative manner, we do believe that the dissemination and exchange of knowledge is extremely important worldwide. But I wanted to mention that developing countries need to draft their own agenda according to their priorities, to their interests, to their needs. Thank you.
I think actually that I think it wasn't Spinoza. I'm keep as you said, a minute of erudition, whatever. Yes. So I think he said something like this. It's very difficult. It's very easy to go into some sort of conflict, war, and stuff, and very difficult to build all form of peace, because peace can take 1,000 faces, something like this. That was quite pathetic phrase, but I think it's very true. And when you do something constructive and how do you say positive, socially important and developing something, it takes a lot of effort, and it could take million of forms. But when we go into destruction and kind of primitive form of life, it normally takes one form of war and destruction. So I think we can learn how to build all this small but fragile but but worlds of living, and that's a very important task for all of us. And I hope that would be one of the takeaways of this gathering today, yesterday, and hope tomorrow and the day after. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a very useful 2 days. I have learned a lot. At the same time, we would like to hope that governments and competition authorities all over the world will open up competition law to the realities which we are facing, basically social realities, environmental realities. It is happening, but I think there is more urgency required.
I can't think of a quote by Spinoza, so I think I'm going to pass, and I have nothing more to add anyway. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And if Frederick is still on the line, we'd invite just a closing remark if you'd wish.
I'm still on the line, and I was ready to engage in a discussion with Thomas about his dilemma. I just want to point out one thing. When you think about sustainability, let's think about what happened in California about 2 or 3 years ago, where 4 automobile manufacturers decided to provide highly, clean cars. And they were accused by the Justice Department, which opened an investigation of maybe having collaborated to increase the price of cars, which could have been anti-competitive. Well, if you change the time focus of your analysis, you get a very different reading, because maybe they concluded to lower the cost of transportation in California, which would be both pro-competitive and pro-efficiency. So I think that before we get into the complication that you have mentioned of having to choose between efficiency and other public interests, we should reflect on whether our short-term perspective is always or is justified, or whether we should have a longer-term analysis, particularly when we're thinking about cumulative effects, such as in the case of sustainability. So I think we do have to reflect, and maybe the problem is easier than the one that you described.
Thank you for that. And Eleanor, if you're still on the line, I wonder if we might hear from you.
Yes, so for my closing, I would like to remind us of a line and concept that Pradeep Mehta has made for so many years, and that is making markets work for people. The people are not the 1%. That is what we are trying to do. That is the core, incidentally, that would sort of keep us on the track of making markets work, but for the people. Thanks.
And thank you. And Sophie,
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me now?
we can.
Okay. Yeah, my immediate concern was, of course, what's happening at the WHO and the WTO. And I look forward to hearing from you what can be done immediately to influence that process. Thank you.
And thank you. So it's not just me, it's to everybody here. And Pradeep will speak in a moment. But just a message for everyone. You might think that the conference is coming to an end. You've heard those things and you're heading off. But that's not so. I'd much prefer that you not think that it's over, but that instead you realize that it's all just beginning. But there's a new paradigm, and that I think everybody here takes with them a solemn charge to be active in thinking through these issues. Some of them we may end up discarding as impractical, or ones which in the end aren't going to actually make the world a better place. But I'd urge everyone as we leave this room to remember those dreadful figures that Teresa and others gave us, that only 14% of the SDGs are on target. That's a very tragic picture from what is so recently the most contemporary statement by the world's governments about what they thought was important. And there's not a single one of those where there isn't a dimension of consumer protection and competition policy that can be applied. And so I think we should take the charge of our conversations, the honor that we've had of being present and participating in these conversations. We started with a poly crisis. We proceeded through poly presentations, and then we ended up with poly suggestions and even some poly solutions. And so I think that these are things that we should regard as being a responsibility that we have in our own context to take some action. Now, I think, Pradeep, you wanted to say a word?
I wanted to thank Elena. Thank you for reminding the people as to what we've been doing since our inception in 1983. And competition policy was certainly a driver of the establishment of cuts. And the good old Monopolies and Restricted Trade Practices Act. Having said that, the point is that, may I request all of you to please go through the welcome speech which I made, where I tried to capture all the nuances of competition policy rather than competition law, gone beyond competition law, in the sense that there are a lot of things which have to be dealt with to a policy approach, which Teresa has also pointed out, and which Mohammed from Egypt also spoke about, the kind of change which I see happening in Egypt. That is the kind of change that we would like to see happening with other competition authorities as well. They start dealing with policy distortion. Secondly, and importantly, is reiterating what Elena said, we have always focused on value for people. In fact, our motto has always been value for people and not value for money. And we draw a distinction between the Western concept and the concept which is important for the developing world, particularly. We still have poverty is a very big issue, continues to remain a big issue. Poverty, disenfranchisement, exclusivity, etc. These are still a lot of these kind of issues which I don't know whether markets can offer the best solutions, but certainly in the overall, we talk about promotion of economic democracy, which is again a very important input for political democracy. So I think that is a message which I would like to leave. And secondly, and then to conclude on a process issue, this is the first conference with which I was not engaged very, very little, if at all. And I would like to congratulate my colleagues, Navneet, Ujjwal, and the others who've done an excellent job. I'm glad that what I've been able to teach all of you. I can see the fruition, which as a teacher gives me a greater pleasure, and particularly also to salute my two mentors on the screen, Eleanor and Fred. Yeah, a salute to you for this event, and I wish you were here in person. But anyway, and Eleanor also, we were all hoping that you were here in person. But having said that, next time, I think the next biennial. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, for this excellent moderation. What I've seen, the way you've done it. And again, let me also mention the other team, Palashka, Arima, Ashik, all the Swiftish, Akshay, Vijay, Ramsaran. And these are all young colleagues who've been working behind the back and also facing my eye from time to time. So participants have already been thanked.
I must interrupt you, Pradeep, as we need to leave.
Yeah, I'm concluding. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Pradeep.